Greetings. In this second mini lecture on British political culture, I want to get back to the discussion of race and nationalism. And as I ended the last lecture, I was saying that from an American perspective, this shouldn't appear to be a big problem, right? That the white population is like 93% of the country, 7% of the population is non-white. But I told you that there are problems. Non-whites are segregated in the ghettos. Their life expectancy is less, their educational attainment is less, their socioeconomic status is less, and so there's a lot of frustration. The debate over race in Britain sounds a lot like the debate in the United States. The Labor Party would sound a lot like American Democrats saying that the problem is poverty, which certainly I uh, have a bias towards. As you know, I grew up in poverty, and I believe that educational opportunities changed my life. I kind of ended the last mini lecture with that. The Conservative Party sounds a lot like the Republicans. They blame laxity, fatherless children, the lack of a work ethic, etc., as the problem, and that in this particular case, the problem is internal to the communities themselves. Now, if you take a look at Great Britain in terms of the race challenge, to me, the most significant challenge, the one that leaps off the page, is that of nationalism. And I talked about how, if you take a look at Ireland or Wales or Scotland, these are nations that for centuries had armed conflict with the English, and England unified these communities into Great Britain after warfare. So, if we take a look at the problem of Northern Ireland first, and I have an interest in Ireland. My brother-in-law lives in Ireland. Uh, Northern Ireland, and if you take a look at Ireland as a whole, if you follow along in your notes, Ireland was ruled by England for approximately 800 years. The English were very predatory towards the Irish. The Irish had their land seized. Some of them were deported. There was significant discrimination against the Catholic faith, and I talked about that earlier when I talked about how King George I, remember in England, was 57th in line for the throne, and yet he got it because the first 56 in line for the throne were Catholic, and they weren't going to allow Catholic kings to come back. The country of Ireland was rocked by the potato famine from 1846 to 1854 that essentially resulted in a mass exodus from the country. Over 1.5 million Irish people left Ireland for the United States. And what's sad is during this period where Irish people were starving and there was mass starvation throughout Ireland, England had ample foodstuffs and would not share it with the Irish. Now, in 1949, most of Ireland became an independent country, the Republic of Ireland. But the exception was the 6 northern counties of Ireland, which remained under British rule. These 6 counties were different in several ways, although Roskin only mentions one, right? The big difference that Roskin mentions is that while Ireland as a whole is overwhelmingly a Catholic country, the 6 northern counties that constitute Northern Ireland today are Protestant in nature. The vast majority of people in Northern Ireland are Protestant. Now, Roskin leaves out some of the story that I think is really significant. Go back to that first chapter when I talked about cross-cutting cleavages, right? That in this particular case, are there other issues that can bring the communities together? or are there additional issues that are going to pull these communities even farther apart? And so we have a religious divide, right? Catholics versus Protestants. But there's the matter of class. The Protestants are much more affluent. They tend to be managers. The Catholics are far less affluent. They tend to be workers. They go to different schools and different clubs, and they don't have a lot of things in common. So there is a lack of cross-cutting cleavages. These tensions were at their worst in the 1960s and 1970s. Over 3,600 people died in Northern Ireland because of violence, bombings, terrorism, until a power sharing arrangement developed in 1998. So I would make the argument that in Northern Ireland there are both objective as well as subjective class distinctions that continue to tug these two communities apart. And so you have kind of a peaceful coexistence, but you even have dueling political parties. The political party in Northern Ireland of the Protestants is the DUP, and the political party of the Catholics in Northern Ireland is Sinn Féin. So not only do you have class distinctions, social distinctions, you even have these people voting for different political parties. The second example of nationalism that is discussed in the chapter is devolution in Scotland and Wales. So devolution is a concept of autonomy, our home rule for a region, in this case Scotland and Wales. One of my pet peeves is a lot of people try to make this argument, and Roskin does, and I just don't buy it, is that devolution is what he called quasi-federalism. I don't believe that at all. Federalism is the constitutional division of power between the national government and the states. There is no constitution in Britain. There isn't constitutional supremacy like there is in the United States. There's parliamentary supremacy. So London has granted Scotland and Wales greater autonomy and greater home rule. But notice that power comes from London, which means that London can take it away. That's not quasi-federalism. That's no more quasi-federalism than Sacramento gives the 58 counties of California significant power. But the state of California granted the counties those powers and can at any given time take them away. Now, let's get back to your notes. Now that I've told you about my disagreement with Roskin, let me get back to the notes. For several decades, both Scotland and Wales were less developed than England, and the result was that the Labour Party polled well in both Scotland and Wales. Of course, England has polled, the Conservatives have polled well in England for decades, and of course, even today, the place where the Conservative Party polls best is in England, right? And urban areas tend to vote Labor, just like in America, urban areas tend to vote for the Democrats. Rural areas in England overwhelmingly vote for the Conservative Party, just like rural areas in America vote for our Conservative Party, the Republicans. The Labour Party for decades favored redistributive policies that brought money to both Scotland and Wales, and so they were very loyal to the Labour Party. But then there was a significant economic event that occurred, the discovery of North Sea oil. And now leaders in Scotland and Wales realized that they had the material means to be independent and said that we don't want to be necessarily allied with England anymore. In fact, all this North Sea oil money we can keep amongst ourselves and not share it with England or with Northern Ireland or with anyone else. And so there were calls for independence, and that call fell on deaf ears, and the compromise was increased devolution. So London has given the Scottish, the Welsh legislatures greater autonomy and greater home rule. However, I wouldn't call it federalism or even quasi federalism, but certainly the discovery of North Sea oil certainly has changed the political calculus. Now, the most popular party in Scotland is no longer the Labour Party, it's the SNP, the Scottish Nationalist Party. And there's a Welsh Nationalist Party that does well in Wales, although the Labour Party actually polls better in Wales than in Scotland. Now, another area that is somewhat related, although I think it's a distinct topic, but Roskin puts it in this section. He probably could have expanded on this concept. He introduces an interesting concept to me called centers. And of course, if I ask you about centers on the exam, the center, at least according to Roskin, is the nation's capital. And certainly in most European societies, this is true. In most European countries, the capital is not just the political capital, but it's the economic capital, it's the social capital, it's the cultural capital. Right in Britain, London is the political capital of the country, it's the economic capital, it's the population, social, cultural center of the country. London dwarfs all other cities in all relevant statistics. The same thing would be true of Paris when we talk about France later. If Italy were one of our countries, Rome would have that same effect. But contrast that to the United States. Washington, D.C. is the political center of the United States. But Washington, D.C. is not the economic center. That would be Los Angeles, Hollywood, etc. It's not the population center, right? It's certainly, the economic center probably would be New York City, right? New York Stock Exchange. So Washington, D.C. is not really a center in the manner in which Roskin means it to be. It is a political capital, but it's not a center in the way that most European capitals are. In the next mini lecture, I'm going to shift away from politics. Although there is politics dripping throughout the whole next topic. The next page is British public policy, what Britons quarrel about. And of course, the big debate is going to be economic, back to who gets what, when, and how. It's about the distribution of resources in society. And you are going to discover that the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have had deep, deep, deep quarrels and debates about how extensive should the welfare state be. They are going to have deep, deep, deep divisions over to what degree should the state determine the economic organization of the country. In other words, should the national government own industries, which is what Labor argued for years? Or should the marketplace determine economic organization, which is what the Conservative Party has typically lobbied for? And in the next mini lecture, we'll talk about the debate between the Labor Party and the Conservative Party from World War II roughly up to about 2000, and then I'll leave the last few years up to you. And Roskin, have a wonderful evening, everyone, and I will be posting mini lectures on British politics real soon. Have a nice evening.